I want you to ignore the warships for a moment. That may sound impossible, because the warships are what everybody sees. They are the image, they are the headline, they are the proof that something serious is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. But the warships are not the center of the story. The center of the story is the decision not to rush. That is what has made this crisis so dangerous for Tehran. The United States did not respond to Iran the way Iran expected. It did not immediately turn the blockade into a dramatic bombing campaign. It did not give the Revolutionary Guards a clean national war to sell to the Iranian people. It did not let the regime say, look, the foreign enemy is attacking us. Now, forget every failure at home. America waited, and waiting under the right conditions is not passive. It is pressure with discipline. The trap at Hormuz works because it changed the question. Iran wanted the question to be, can America force the strait open? That question helps Tehran because it turns the crisis into a military contest and lets the regime speak in the old language of resistance. But America changed the question to something much more painful. Can Iran survive being the only country locked out of the waterway it thought it controlled? That is the question now. And Iran has no good answer. The design is simple, but devastating. The strait is open enough for the world. Gulf oil moves, commercial ships move, the global system bends, but it does not break. Iran's old threat was that Hormuz could make everyone bleed. The American answer was to make Hormuz function for everyone except Iran. That is the reversal. Iran tried to turn geography into blackmail. America turned geography into isolation. Once that happened, the pressure stopped being mainly external. It became internal. And internal pressure is the kind regimes fear most because there is no foreign enemy to blame when your own institutions begin fighting each other in public. Inside Iran, the regime is no longer moving like one body. It is moving like a body whose nerves are sending contradictory signals. The Revolutionary Guards want escalation. The diplomats want a way out. The people want relief. The conventional army wants to know why it is bleeding for a system that never trusted it. Those four forces are now trapped together, and the blockade is squeezing all of them at once. Start with the IRGC to outside observers. The Revolutionary Guards look like the most ideological part of the Iranian system. And they are, but ideology is only one part of their power. The deeper reality is that the IRGC is also an economic empire. It lives inside construction, telecoms, ports, oil contracts, banking channels, smuggling routes, military procurement, and political privilege. It is not simply defending the revolution. It has become one of the biggest beneficiaries of the revolution. That is why peace is so dangerous for it. Peace does not just end a battlefield. Peace opens an audit. In permanent struggle, the IRGC can explain everything. Why it needs money, why it needs secrecy, why it controls economic assets, why criticism is betrayal, why hardship is patriotic, why soldiers must obey, why ordinary people must wait. But if the war ends badly, or if a deal exposes the cost of the war, then the question changes. People stop asking, how do we resist the enemy? They start asking, who made us poor? That is the question the IRGC cannot survive comfortably. So the guards do what institutions do when their existence depends on conflict. They demand more conflict. They call compromise treason. They attack the language of negotiation. They treat the foreign ministry as an enemy inside the state. They fire on ships while diplomats try to signal flexibility. They speak as if escalation is courage, when in reality it may be self-preservation. That is not strength. That is an institution afraid that peace will expose its business model. Now look at the diplomatic wing, the president, the foreign minister, and the parliamentary figures who still understand state survival are watching a different clock. They see reconstruction costs. They see damaged ports. They see damaged industry. They see the currency falling. They see oil revenue disappearing. They see popular trust eroding. They see the impossibility of governing a population that is being told to endure more sacrifice, while the elite factions fight over who gets to define loyalty. Their argument is not sentimental, it is practical. A state cannot negotiate after it has lost the machinery of the state. That is why the diplomatic faction needs time, but also needs speed. It needs enough time to build a face-saving deal, but it does not have enough time before the oil clock, the street clock, and the military clock converge. So they speak carefully. They try to create openings. They tell the world Hormuz can be open. They try to show that the government can still make commitments. Then the IRGC contradicts them. This is the moment where the outside world needs to pay attention. When a foreign minister says one thing and armed forces do the opposite, that is not a messaging problem. It is a sovereignty problem. It means the state cannot guarantee that its own words are operationally meaningful. A government can survive disagreement. It cannot easily survive a situation where one arm negotiates and another arm sabotages the negotiation in real time. That is what America is waiting for the world to see. Not that Iran has enemies. Everyone knows that Iran has stopped being a single decision-making machine. The third force is the one no regime ever wants to face, honestly, the public. For years, Iran's rulers have treated public pain as a manageable cost. Inflation can be explained. Sanctions can be blamed on America. Repression can be framed as order. Sacrifice can be wrapped in religion, nationalism, or resistance. But some images cut through every explanation. Fuel lines in an oil-producing country are one of them. They tell people the system is not merely unfair, it is absurd. Iran produces oil, yet people wait for gasoline. Iran speaks about regional power, yet families worry about basic supplies. Iran funds influence abroad, yet factories at home struggle with energy. Iran tells citizens it is winning, yet the daily experience of life tells them something else. That gap between official victory and personal hardship is where revolutions begin to find oxygen. And the protest pattern matters. This is not just one square in Tehran. It is not just one city after one price hike. The danger for the regime is geographic spread. Multiple cities, different social groups, different grievances, all beginning to recognize the same cause. When unrest spreads, repression becomes a resource problem. The regime can crush a street. It cannot be everywhere at once without exhausting itself. And today, the same forces expected to suppress protests are also expected to hold military positions, guard infrastructure, manage internal suspicion, replace deserters, and defend a system whose money is drying up. That brings us to the fourth force, Artesh. This is the part of the story that can change everything, and it is also the part people outside Iran often miss. The conventional military is not the IRGC. It carries a different history. It was inherited from an older state. The revolution never fully trusted it. So the Revolutionary Guards were built as a parallel military and ideological counterweight. For decades, that arrangement allowed the regime to balance fear against fear. The Guards got privilege. The conventional army got suspicion. Now the crisis is putting that old insult under battlefield stress. When soldiers are undersupplied, they do not think in slogans forever. They count ammunition. They count meals. They count who gets medical evacuation and who does not. They count whose wounded are treated and whose wounded are left behind. They count which commanders have equipment and which units are told to endure. Those calculations are not abstract. A soldier with 20 rounds shared across 2 men understands reality faster than a television host can explain it away. And when the public starts chanting that the army is with the people, that is not just a chant. It is a strategic message aimed at the one institution that could make repression fail. The people are not asking the IRGC to change. They know what the IRGC is. They are asking the conventional military to choose Iran over the faction that claims to own Iran. That is the most dangerous political invitation in the country right now. If Artesh remains obedient, the regime still has tools. If Artesh hesitates, every protest becomes harder to crush. If Artesh aligns with the diplomats, the IRGC sees a coup. If the IRGC turns inward to prevent that alignment, the regime's internal fracture becomes open conflict. This is why the blockade is more than a maritime operation. It is a machine that forces hidden questions into the open. Who speaks for Iran? Who commands the guns? Who pays the soldiers? Who controls the ports? Who owns the pain? And who benefits from continuing a war the country cannot afford? The genius of the American position, if we can call it that, is that it does not need to answer these questions. It only needs to keep the conditions in place long enough for Iranians to answer them against each other. That is what waiting means here. Every day the blockade holds, the IRGC must spend more political capital defending a strategy that produces less material benefit. Every day oil fails to move, the state's financial runway shortens. Every day refined fuel cannot enter smoothly. The public sees failure. Every day soldiers are unpaid or undersupplied. Loyalty becomes more expensive. Every day diplomats are contradicted. International actors trust Tehran less. Every day China stays cold. Iran's leadership discovers that partnership is not rescue. That last point is important. Iran's leaders counted on the outside world to be more desperate than Washington. They counted on China needing energy. They counted on Russia wanting to embarrass the United States. They counted on proxy networks to create pressure. They counted on the Gulf fearing instability. They counted on the fact that Hormuz matters to everyone. But there is a difference between needing Hormuz and needing Iran. China needs the waterway open. It does not necessarily need the IRGC to win. Russia benefits when Iranian oil is trapped and Russian energy becomes more valuable. It can speak the language of solidarity while quietly enjoying the market opportunity. Proxy groups depend on Tehran's strength, not just Tehran's rhetoric. If Iran cannot protect its own leverage, every proxy begins to ask whether loyalty still pays. The Gulf states want stability, not Iranian victory. That means Iran is discovering something brutal. The world may fear chaos in Hormuz, but that does not mean the world will save Tehran from the consequences of creating it. And that changes the bargaining table. The regime used to believe that escalation created leverage. Now, escalation may be destroying the support system that made leverage possible. That is why the IRGC's choices look increasingly desperate: fire on ships. And you prove the diplomats cannot control the state, threaten more. And you make regional actors more likely to accept American protection bloc talks. And the economy burns faster, accept talks, and the guards risk losing the revolutionary frame that protects their power. Crack down on protests, and you need loyal forces. But the loyalty of those forces is being tested by the same shortages and inequalities the crackdown is supposed to hide. It is a closed circle, and it is closing inward. This does not mean collapse is guaranteed. Serious states can endure extraordinary pressure. The Iranian system has survived protests before. It has survived sanctions before. It has survived assassinations, strikes, sabotage, isolation, and internal competition. But the combination matters. It is not just pressure from outside. It is pressure synchronized across every weak point. Revenue, fuel, public patience, elite unity, proxy confidence, foreign support. Each one is a separate fracture. Together, they become structural. That is what makes this moment different from a normal round of sanctions or a normal military standoff. The United States is not merely raising the cost of Iranian behavior, it is making the cost appear inside every internal argument at the same time. The diplomats can say the country needs a deal. The IRGC can say the country needs resistance. The people can say the country needs bread and fuel. The army can ask why it should die for the guards. The proxies can ask whether Tehran still has money. The outside powers can ask whether Iran is still a useful partner. And because all those questions are arriving together, no faction has enough time to solve its own problem before the next problem worsens. That is the power of the clock, not one clock. Many clocks: oil storage, soldier loyalty, fuel supply, protest geography, diplomatic credibility, proxy morale, elite fear. Iran is not racing against America alone. It is racing against itself, and that is why the most dangerous man in this story may not be the American commander at sea. It may be the hardliner in Tehran who decides that controlled collapse is better than negotiated humiliation. Because when an institution has tied its identity to permanent conflict, peace can look like surrender, even when peace is the only way for the country to survive. That is where the risk becomes extreme. The rational path for Iran may be negotiation. The rational path for the IRGC may be escalation. Those two facts can be true at the same time. And when the state's rational interest and the ruling faction's institutional interest separate, history becomes unstable very quickly. The next phase will not be determined only by whether American ships hold the line. They can hold the line. That part is not the mystery. The mystery is what happens inside Iran while the line holds. Does the diplomatic wing gain enough leverage to force a deal? Does the IRGC move first against the diplomats? Does Artesh stay neutral, side with the state, or drift toward the people? Do protests remain local explosions, or do they become a national rhythm? Does China decide that a weakened Iran is still useful, or that stability in Hormuz matters more? Does Russia keep performing friendship while taking Iran's market share? Does the proxy network stay loyal when the center looks unable to protect itself? These are the questions now. Not whether Iran can threaten Hormuz, it already did. The question is whether Iran can survive the consequences of having that threat neutralized, because that is what changed. The strait did not become irrelevant. It became more important than ever. But it no longer works as Iran's shield in the same way. A shield protects you when it is in your hands. A shield becomes a prison door when someone else controls when it opens. That is what America has done. It took the place Iran thought it could close and made it operate without Iran. It took the fear premium Iran relied on and narrowed it. It took the regime's favorite external threat and turned it into an internal exposure. That is why Washington is, because noise would help Tehran. Noise would give the IRGC a cleaner enemy. Noise would turn the story back into America versus Iran. Silence keeps the story where it hurts the regime most. Iran versus Iran, the streets are not waiting for a press release. The soldiers are not waiting for a slogan. The oil wells are not waiting for ideology. The fuel lines are not waiting for state television. The diplomats are not waiting because they want to. They are waiting because the guards have made movement dangerous, and the guards are not waiting calmly. They are watching the country discover that their war may have protected their empire more than it protected Iran. That discovery is the real weapon at Hormuz. Not the carrier, not the destroyer, not the sanctions announcement, the realization. Once a population realizes the pain is not buying victory, but buying the survival of a faction, every hour of suffering changes, meaning that is why this crisis is moving from the sea into the state. And once it reaches the state, nobody can fully control where it ends. America can maintain the blockade, the IRGC can threaten escalation, the diplomats can search for language. China can calculate, Russia can profit, the proxies can hesitate, the Gulf can pray the fire does not spread. But the final decision may come from somewhere much simpler. A soldier refusing an order, a city refusing fear, a commander refusing to fire, a government office refusing the lie, a fuel line becoming a political movement. That is why the United States waited, because the most devastating defeat for Iran's hardliners would not be losing a ship. It would be losing the story they used to command the country for 45 years. The story was resistance. Now the story may become exhaustion, and exhausted nations do not always rise in one heroic moment. Sometimes they simply stop believing the men who keep asking them to suffer. When that happens, the strongest blockade is not at sea, it is inside the regime itself.